The invitation arrived on thick cream paper, edged in gold leaf and sealed with a crimson wax crest. It was addressed in elegant handwriting to Hercule Poirot, currently residing in a discreet luxury hotel overlooking the city's grand boulevard. The message was brief, polite, and strangely urgent, an invitation to a private evening gathering at an old aristocratic mansion on the outskirts of town, hosted by a reclusive socialite known for her extravagant soirees and her powerful circle of guests. Poirot noted at once that the letter contained no signature, only the impression of the same crest, stamped in wax. A curious omission. A deliberate one, he accepted. That night the mansion stood luminous against the dark countryside, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. Chauffeured cars lined the sweeping gravel drive. Inside, the air was perfumed with expensive cologne, vintage champagne, and whispered secrets. The guests, politicians, financiers, titled heirs, and socialites moved through gilded rooms as though on a stage, each smile carefully rehearsed. Poirot observed quietly from the edge of the grand salon, his immaculate moustache twitching as he catalogued faces, voices, gestures. Every laugh seemed half a performance. Every glance carried weight. At precisely 9 o'clock, the hostess appeared. She was a woman in her early 40s, striking, composed, draped in black silk and diamonds. Her presence commanded instant silence. She welcomed her guests, raised a glass, and announced a special Surprising exclusive vintage champagne imported at extraordinary cost, served only tonight in honor of an unnamed occasion. Crystal flutes were distributed by attentive staff. Poirot noticed that each glass had been filled moments earlier from the same bottle, poured at a side table in full view of the guests. No secrecy, no trickery apparent. The toast was made. The hostess sipped first, as etiquette demanded. Others followed. Laughter resumed. Music swelled from a quartet in the corner, and the evening flowed onward. Then, less than 5 minutes later, the hostess swayed. At first, it seemed a faint dizziness. She grasped the back of a chair. Her glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor. Conversations halted. A murmur spread. Poirot moved forward just as she collapsed, her breath shallow, her skin suddenly pale as ivory. A physician among the guests knelt beside her, called for water, for space, for calm. But within minutes, it was clear she was dead. The shock rippled through the room. No one had left. No one had approached her after the toast. Every guest had drunk the same champagne. The bottle stood empty on the side table. The servants stared, terrified. Doors were locked immediately at Poirot's quiet suggestion. No one entered or exited the mansion. The police arrived swiftly, summoned by the house steward. A preliminary examination confirmed what the physician already suspected: poisoning, a fast-acting toxin, introduced shortly before or during the toast. Yet the champagne had been poured in plain sight. No suspicious movements, no opportunity, no apparent motive. Even more puzzling, the hostess had lived alone in the mansion. No close family, few confidants. Her will, stored in a safe in her private study, left her entire estate to an unnamed beneficiary. The safe was locked. The study door had been locked from the inside. Its windows were bolted. Nothing inside appeared disturbed. A locked study. A public toast. A victim who drank first. A room full of people who all consumed the same drink and, yet only one died. The police were baffled. They sealed the mansion. They questioned the guests. They found nothing. No hidden vials, no tainted glass, no switched bottle, no clear enemy among the assembled elite. And in the corner of the grand salon, amid the fading scent of spilled champagne and the glittering shards of crystal on the floor, Hercule Poirot stood silently, fingertips pressed together, his eyes fixed on a single detail almost everyone else had overlooked. A small gold-rimmed saucer beneath the hostess glass, bearing the faintest smudge of deep red wax. The same wax as the crest on the invitation. An invitation, a toast, a death, and a crime that appeared, at first glance, impossible. The grand salon had emptied of its music and laughter, replaced now by the low murmur of police voices and the occasional sharp scratch of a pen on paper. Guests sat in uneasy clusters, guarded by officers at each doorway. Some whispered behind gloved hands, others stared straight ahead, as though refusing to meet any eyes might erase their presence from the evening entirely. Poirot moved among them with quiet courtesy, neither interfering with the authorities nor withdrawing from the scene. He simply observed. The local inspector, a capable man with tired eyes and a stiff collar, was directing the investigation in brisk, methodical strokes: collect names, secure evidence, question servants, seal exits. Everything correct. Everything proper. And yet, Poirot thought, method alone would not find the crack in this puzzle. This crime had been designed to withstand ordinary scrutiny. He returned to the small side table where the champagne had been poured. The empty bottle stood upright, label pristine, cork resting beside it. Several crystal flutes remained, half finished, some barely touched. Officers had already marked the table as evidence, but no one had thought to look closely at the base of each glass. Poirot bent slightly, hands clasped behind his back. Under the bright chandelier, he examined the saucer-white porcelain with gold rims, identical in design. All but one were spotless. Only the saucer that had belonged to the hostess bore the faint smear of red wax. He touched it lightly with the tip of his finger, then lifted it to his nose. Wax, yes. The same type used to seal formal envelopes, but how had it come here? It did not belong on a serving tray, and it had not fallen from the ceiling. He glanced toward the fallen shards of her broken flute. Among them lay a thin sliver of glass, curved like a tiny crescent. An officer was about to sweep the fragments aside when Poirot intervened with gentle urgency. "Pardon, monsieur. This piece, if you please." The officer hesitated, then handed it to him with tweezers. Poirot held it up to the light. On the edge of the sliver, barely visible, was a faint, cloudy residue. Not champagne. Something thicker. Something that had clung to glass before dissolving. A delayed toxin, perhaps. One that needed time. One that could have been applied before the glass ever reached the table. But Fenway had only one person died. The inspector approached, notebook in hand. "Monsieur Poirot, the medical examiner confirms poison, but he says it acted within minutes. If the champagne were tainted, more victims would already be showing symptoms. No one else is ill." "Precisely," Poirot said softly. "Which means the poison was not in the bottle. Then someone tampered with her glass." "Yes. But where and when?" "Because we have witnesses who swear the glasses were poured openly." The inspector frowned. "We have questioned the serving staff. None left the room between pouring and serving. No one approached the table afterward." Poirot inclined his head politely, but his eyes drifted to the guests. They were being questioned one by one. Most answered with polite outrage or trembling shock, but one reaction caught Poirot's attention. A gentleman in a silver waistcoat, his fingers worrying a signet ring again and again, not from grief, from anxiety. The man kept glancing toward the locked doors, as though calculating distances. Another woman dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Too dry. Too careful. Not a tear stain upon the silk. Poirot watched them all, filing away every tremor, every hesitation, every unnecessary word. Then there were the invitations. He requested to see those that had brought the guests here tonight. Most produced theirs readily, proud of their ornate stationery. All bore the same crest. All had been sealed in the same red wax. Yet when Poirot examined the edges of the envelopes, he noticed something subtle. On most, the wax seal had been broken cleanly, lifted with care. But on one invitation, the wax had been melted again after opening, resealed clumsily, leaving a slight uneven ridge. The invitation belonged to the hostess herself. Curious. Why would she reseal her own invitation? Poirot's eyes sparkled faintly, though his expression remained calm. Someone had taken that invitation. Someone had broken its seal, tampered with something, and sealed it again. Something small. Something dangerous. Something that had eventually found its way onto a champagne glass. The first threads of deception were beginning to show, but the full pattern was still hidden, waiting patiently for the little grey cells to complete the design. The questioning began in earnest as midnight pressed against the tall windows of the mansion. One by one, the guests were brought into the smaller drawing room, where the inspector waited with his notebook, and Poirot sat quietly nearby, seemingly an afterthought. Yet it was often the afterthought who noticed the truth. The first was a politician of considerable influence, his hair silver, his voice smooth as polished marble. He spoke of admiration for the hostess, of gratitude for her invitation, of mild shock at the tragedy. He described the toast precisely, almost too precisely, as though he had rehearsed it. The champagne was poured openly, he said. No one touched the glasses afterward. I saw it myself. We all raised our flutes. She drank first. It was perfectly normal. Poirot smiled politely. You watched the pouring closely, monsieur. Of course, one must be observant in my profession. Indeed, Poirot murmured. And after you drank, where did you place your glass? The man blinked. On the saucer, naturally. But your saucer, Poirot said gently, has no trace of wax upon it. The politician stiffened, just slightly. Wax. Poirot waved a hand. A trivial detail. Forgive me. But the man's composure had already cracked, just enough for Poirot to note it. Next came the woman with the dry handkerchief. She spoke softly, her eyes lowered, her voice threaded with sorrow. She insisted she had been a dear friend of the hostess, almost a sister in spirit. She had no enemies, she said, no reason for anyone to wish her harm. She herself had sipped only a little champagne, as she never drank much. She described feeling faint after the incident, nearly hysterical. Poirot regarded her kindly. You say you were close friends? Yes, she whispered, very close. And yet, Poirot said, you arrived tonight in a separate car. You were not seated beside her. And when she collapsed, you did not rush forward at once. The woman looked up sharply. I was shocked. Of course, Poirot agreed. Shock affects us all differently. But her knuckles whitened around her handkerchief, twisting it until the fabric strained. One by one, the guests came. A financier who insisted on his innocence before any accusation was made. A young heir who laughed nervously, saying it was all too dramatic to be real. A retired colonel who recounted the sequence of events with military precision, yet somehow omitted the exact moment the glasses were collected and distributed. Always, Poirot listened. Always he asked small, seemingly irrelevant questions, and always tiny inconsistencies appeared, like hairline cracks in porcelain. Meanwhile, the servants were questioned in the hallway. They had poured the champagne under instruction. They had carried the tray. They had set the glasses down. None had left the room. None had touched the glasses after placement. Their testimonies matched, too perfectly. At last the house steward entered. A tall man, thin as a candle, with eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze. He spoke carefully, choosing each word as though it cost him something. The invitations were prepared by a printing house, he explained. They were delivered in sealed envelopes. I posted them myself. The mistress kept her own invitation on her writing desk. As she admired the craftsmanship, Poirot leaned forward slightly. And who had access to her study? No one, monsieur. She valued privacy. And yet, Poirot said softly, someone handled her invitation after it was sealed. The steward's throat bobbed. Impossible. Perhaps, Poirot agreed. But the wax seal was broken and resealed. I have seen it. Silence fell. The steward's eyes flicked, just once, toward the locked door of the study down the corridor. When the questioning paused, the inspector exhaled in frustration. Everyone has an alibi. No one left the room. No one touched the glass. No one admits a quarrel with the victim. It is madness. Poirot steepled his fingers. Not madness, mon ami. Design. He rose and walked slowly back into the grand salon, where the shattered glass still glinted on the marble floor. He looked at the empty champagne bottle, the pristine saucers, the one marked by wax, the sliver of glass with its cloudy residue. Then he thought of the resealed invitation, of the locked study, of the will inside the safe, of the unnamed beneficiary. Somewhere in this elegant house, beneath polite words and shocked expressions, a motive lay hidden, and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make murder appear impossible. But impossible. Poirot spent the next hours wandering silently through the mansion, retracing steps and observing small, easily overlooked details, the faint indentation of a slipper on the polished carpet, the way a curtain had been brushed aside, the peculiar angle of a portrait that seemed to lean toward the empty space of the study. But even more revealing were the conversations he overheard as guests murmured, among themselves, their polite veneers slipping in moments of private speculation. Each whisper hinted at a motive, yet no single thread tied them all together. Greed, jealousy, fear. revenge. The mansion itself seemed to hum with unspoken grudges, hidden resentments, and old intrigues. The financier, for instance, had grown visibly pale when discussing the hostess' fortune. He had recently suffered a series of poor investments, rumors suggested, and her death could conveniently shift assets his way, at least remove a competitor in the intricate social web of wealth. The politician, though outwardly composed, had been caught in several compromising negotiations that the hostess had threatened to expose. He had wealth, influence, and much to lose if her goodwill turned sour. And then there was the young heir, his nervous laughter masking a simmering jealousy. He had long admired the hostess' circle and resented her favor toward others more than himself. Every guest, Poirot noted, possessed the capacity for both civility and betrayal. Yet none of these motives, however plausible, explained the mechanics of the crime. A single sip of champagne, a solitary death, no visible intervention, and the locked study with its sealed safe. Each alibi, when examined superficially, seemed flawless. But Poirot's instinct told him that appearances were deliberately constructed to mislead. He returned to the drawing room where the invitations had been displayed. The resealed envelope continued to intrigue him. Whoever had handled it had left no fingerprints, no smear of nothing except the subtle imperfection in the wax. And the hostess, by all accounts, had cherished that invitation, keeping it in her study as a memento of its artistry. The act of breaking and resealing it implied premeditation. Someone had needed access not merely to the invitation but to its content, or perhaps to the symbolism it carried, as a key to the evening's arrangement. Poirot called the steward aside. "Tell me again of the will, the safe, and the study." The man cleared his throat. "The safe is unbroken. The will names a single beneficiary, monsieur, though the mistress kept the contents private. No one knows who. The study was locked, as always, and the keys kept with the mistress. No one entered it during the evening. No one except, perhaps, whoever had access to her personal items earlier." Poirot said softly. "Perhaps the invitation, yes. Perhaps it served as a vehicle, not for the message it carried, but for something hidden within or beneath. It is often so, mon ami. A clue that appears trivial is frequently the very mechanism of the crime." He studied the guests once more. Their faces were pale, strained, yet each held a story. The woman with the dry handkerchief had been quietly managing the hostess' charitable accounts. Her influence, subtle yet considerable, could shift both power and fortune. The colonel, with his precise recounting, had owed the hostess a long-standing favor, yet he had publicly expressed disdain for some of her personal choices and irritation that might harbor concealed resentment. Every person had a reason to act, every connection a potential trigger. The mansion itself seemed a labyrinth of motives, each corridor lined with secrets, each room shadowed by ambition or fear. Poirot made a small note in his pocket notebook. Motive alone is insufficient. The act required knowledge, timing, and opportunity. The opportunity is artificial, designed to mislead. The key lies not in the obvious greed or envy, but in the subtle manipulation of appearances. He walked again to the side table where the champagne had been poured. The wax-stained saucer rested among its companions. The shards of the hostess' broken flute caught the light, the tiny residue glinting faintly. A single glance at these items reminded him of the poison's mechanics, the precision required, the patience of the perpetrator. This was no impulsive act of rage or opportunistic crime. It was careful, calculated, and, most importantly, intimately informed. Whoever had executed it had observed, learned, and waited, understanding the habits and rituals of every individual in the room. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the tall windows, Poirot finally seated himself, not to rest, but to think. He laid out the pieces in his mind, motives, tangled like threads of fine silk, each intersecting, fraying, and overlapping in subtle ways. One thread, invisible to all others, would ultimately reveal the perpetrator. Greed explained intent. Jealousy explained opportunity. Fear explained secrecy. But only a mind trained to notice the imperceptible would see how these motives had been woven into the fabric of a perfectly orchestrated evening. And that mind, Poirot knew, belonged to him. The solution was close, closer than any of the authorities suspected. Every guest had a reason, yes, but the path of execution was the true signature of the criminal. It would be that signaturine, not the tangled motivest that would illuminate the truth. Ott thought was merely a challenge to the little grey cells. The first rays of morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Officers busied themselves, cataloguing evidence, reviewing notes, and conferring in low voices. At last, the inspector approached Poirot with a mix of triumph and relief etched across his face. In his hand was a small, leather-bound notebook found tucked beneath a sideboard in the corner of the grand salon. It belonged to the young heir. "Mon Dieu, Poirot," the inspector said, almost breathless. This proves it. Notes on the hostess, on her habits, on the timing of the evening's events, planned it all. I'm afraid the solution is straightforward. He must have had access to the glasses before they were poured. Case closed. The heir, pale and trembling, had already been brought forward, his denial wavering under the weight of the notebook's contents. Other guests murmured, nodding at what appeared to be a definitive breakthrough. The inspector seemed ready to breathe a sigh of relief, certain that justice was within reach. Poirot, however, remained seated quietly, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Inspector," he said softly, "pardon, but I am not convinced." "It is too simple, too neat." The inspector blinked. "Too simple?" "Monsieur Poirot, we have the notebook. Notes, observations, calculations, even diagrams. The young heir planned the toast and the distribution of the glasses. What more could you require?" Poirot's gaze swept the room, noting the disarray left by a night of terror. The shards of crystal still glimmered, the empty bottle lay untouched, and the wax-stained saucer rested innocently among its companions. "Ah, yes," he murmured. "The notebook is persuasive, certainly, yet it is not proof. It is a map of possibility, not of action. He may have imagined it, rehearsed it in writing, and yet never carried it out." The inspector frowned. "And you think someone else did?" "Mon ami," Poirot replied, "in this room there are always shadows where one does not immediately see them. The real execution required finesse, patience, observation. The heir is reckless, impulsive, and nervous, yet the act itself was precise, controlled. The powder on the flute shard look, not a touch was misplaced. Only someone calm, someone who knew every detail of the evening, could achieve this." The inspector hesitated, glancing between the young heir and Poirot, unsure whether to trust the detective's intuition or the apparent evidence. Poirot rose, smoothing his immaculate suit. He walked slowly around the table, lifting each empty glass, inspecting the subtle differences in residue, the faintest imperfections on the saucers. "You see this?" he said quietly, holding the gold-rimmed saucer between thumb and forefinger. "Wax, applied with intention, not by accident. And this sliver of glass, notice the residue. It dissolves only in the final moments, precisely after the toast, when all eyes are elsewhere. Such an act cannot be performed by a nervous young man clutching a notebook. No, it requires certainty, patience, and freedom of movement at the right moment." The inspector's confidence wavered. "Then, who?" Poirot smiled faintly, though his eyes remained serious. "Patience, mon ami. The real criminal is still at large. Observe the guests. Notice their expressions, their hesitation, their relief at the supposed solution. There is one who relaxes too easily, who smiles too faintly, who allows the illusion of justice to settle before him. That is the predator who waits while the authorities chase shadows." He paused, looking toward the woman with the dry handkerchief. Her eyes glistened with calculated grief. She dabbed at them with careful precision, but her fingers trembled just slightly, betraying her control. Poirot's gaze shifted to the politician, who now leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as though he had expected this outcome all along. And the steward, too, stood by the door, face neutral, hands folded neatly, yet his eyes flickered to the wax-stained invitation, as though noting something he did not wish to reveal. "Justice, Inspector, is not satisfied with convenience," Poirot said, voice low but firm. "It demands truth, and truth is rarely simple. The notebook, the heir, the apparent planning fee are a diversion, a false victory. The crime itself is cleverer than it seems, and the culprit remains invisible, waiting for the opportune moment. We must look deeper, always deeper." The inspector's notebook trembled in his hand. The young heir stammered denials, but the tension in the room shifted. Poirot's calm certainty contrasted sharply with the official relief. Somewhere in the mansion the true criminal lingered, hidden beneath layers of politeness and strategy, watching as the authorities celebrated a solution that was not yet real. And Poirot, ever patient, knew that the final move would come only when the little grey cells revealed the invisible hand that orchestrated it all. Poirot spent the morning moving quietly through the mansion, retracing the sequence of the evening in his mind, while the inspector and his team busied themselves with paperwork and interviews. The false victory of the heir's notebook had created a fragile calm, but the detective sensed tension lingering like a current beneath the surface. He had to examine not only what was present, but also what had been forgotten, what lay buried beneath polite facades and discarded memories. In the library, a room lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy curtains, Poirot paused. The hostess had loved rare books, and her collection was meticulous. As he ran a gloved finger along the spines, a faint impression caught his attention, a book slightly protruding from the others, its leather cover unusually worn. He drew it from the shelf. Inside, he discovered an old newspaper clipping carefully pressed between the pages. It reported a scandal from nearly a decade ago. A failed financial venture, embezzlement accusations, and the subsequent disgrace of a prominent family. The photograph showed a younger version of the politician and the hostess together, their expressions tense yet intimate, suggesting a complicated relationship. Poirot's mind worked swiftly, connecting threads. The politician had been seen attending social functions with the hostess, but their past connection long forgotten by the public introduced a motive more subtle than wealth or envy alone. It spoke of betrayal, lingering resentment, and perhaps a desire for revenge carefully disguised beneath public civility. He turned his attention to the other guests. The woman with the dry handkerchief had managed the hostess' charitable accounts for years, a position granting her intimate knowledge of finances and social ties. Yet a closer examination of her manner, the way she flinched at references to the past, suggested she too had been involved in prior disputes, perhaps minor at the time but potent enough to create resentment. Poirot noted how easily the guests' motives intertwined when viewed through the lens of history. Old alliances, secret debts, unspoken favors, and unresolved arguments created a network of tension far more complex than the inspector had imagined. A casual observer might see only social pleasantries. Poirot saw carefully maintained masks concealing long-held grudges. Each mask was connected by the faintest threads that led directly to the evening's crime. The wax-stained invitation returned to his mind. Its significance now seemed twofold. Not only a practical means to access the hostess glass, but a symbol linking the present crime to the past. Someone had understood the habits, the rituals, and the vulnerabilities of the hostess. To act with such precision required knowledge that extended beyond a single evening. It required memory, experience, and perhaps a grudge nurtured over years. Poirot's gaze then settled on the steward, who had watched the proceedings with unwavering calm. The man had prepared the invitations, handled deliveries, and knew the mansion intimately. He appeared neutral, yet something in his posture suggested the memory of old events, the recollection of grudges long suppressed. A flicker of recognition crossed Poirot's mind. He had seen this once before, in another case involving meticulous planning, silent observation, and revenge carried out under the guise of civility. The same patterns repeated themselves here, though the players were different. By the afternoon, Poirot gathered the guests once more in the drawing-room. He did not speak at first. He allowed the weight of silence to press upon them, observing reactions, noting the tiny betrayals of expression, the quickening of a pulse, the slight tightening of a hand around a handkerchief, the fleeting avoidance of a glance. History was alive in that room, and he could read it like a ledger, each movement and hesitation a footnote to past conflicts. He began to speak quietly, almost casually, outlining innocuous details of the hostess' past interactions with each of them. No accusation, no judgment, merely observation. Yet as he spoke, the room shifted. Subtle exchange glances, micro-expressions revealed connections hidden beneath layers of politeness. The politician and the steward, it seemed, had once been partners in a minor scheme, a financial arrangement gone sour, which the hostess had exposed to protect her own interests. The woman managing the accounts had been unwittingly caught between them, aware of secrets but unsure of how to act. Poirot's small grey cells clicked into place. The crime was not merely about fortune or opportunity. It was about the posture carefully tended grudge, a lingering bitterness, a desire to correct perceived slights. The murderer had planned with surgical precision, using knowledge accumulated over years, exploiting weaknesses and relationships no one else had considered. The mansion, the guests, the wax-stained saucer, the shattered glass, all of it now lay under a new light. The past had returned to claim its due, and only by untangling these shadows could Poirot bring the invisible hand to justice. Somewhere in that room, watching the guests squirm under the weight of his observations, the true criminal waited, confident that the web of history had been hidden well enough. But Poirot, as always, was several steps ahead. Poirot had spent the better part of the afternoon piecing together the threads of history, motive, and opportunity. Yet, despite all that he had observed, he knew that theory alone could not force the truth into the open. Sometimes, he reflected, the criminal revealed themselves only when confronted not by accusation, but by subtle provocation. And so he devised a plan, a gentle test of character, a psychological maneuver designed to unsettle without seeming
I am making
confrontational.
inquiries
He
regarding
returned to
the
the grand
guest in
salon as
suite
the late
402.
afternoon light slanted
Do you
through the
know if
tall
he is
windows,
currently in
casting long,
residence?
One
trembling
moment,
shadows
sir.
across
I
the
shall
polished
check the
marble.
register
The guests were
immediately.
gathered once more, murmuring quietly among themselves, still tense from the revelations about the past. Poirot allowed the room to settle into silence before he spoke, his voice calm and precise. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, we have discussed many details of the evening and examined the threads connecting us all. Yet there remains one simple question, a question that is not answered by motive or observation alone. We must consider the act itself, who could execute it with absolute control under the gaze of so many without leaving a single visible trace. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The guests shifted uneasily, eyes flicking from one face to another. Poirot continued, leaning slightly on the mantelpiece, his expression serene, almost benign. I propose a little experiment, he said, a demonstration, if you will, of attention and timing. Each of you shall hold a crystal flute, as we did at the toast. You will raise it, as though offering a celebratory gesture, and set it down upon the table. Nothing more. No one will be judged for simple movement, of course, but observe carefully what is required to perform even the most ordinary act with care, under scrutiny. Even the smallest tremor may betray a secret. The guests complied, some with mild curiosity, some with visible reluctance. Hands shook slightly, flutes tilted precariously, some glasses clinked against the table. Poirot observed each movement with careful attention, his eyes flicking to details most would overlook. The angle of the fingers, the firmness of the grip, the faintest hesitation before releasing the glass. Then it was the politician's turn. He raised his glass smoothly, with apparent confidence, and set it down neatly. But as he withdrew his hand, Poirot noticed the smallest, almost imperceptible tremor, a subtle flexing of the wrist, a microsecond hesitation as if he had paused, calculating an action invisible to all but the most trained eye. Poirot's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. He moved to the woman with the dry handkerchief. Her motion was careful, almost too careful. She placed the flute perfectly straight, yet a faint flush had risen along her neck, and her eyes flickered toward the wax-stained saucer. Something unspoken passed between her fingers and that tiny mark on the table. Poirot leaned slightly closer, his gaze sharp. Finally, he turned toward the steward. The man's hands were steady, almost unnaturally so. He lifted the flute, raised it with exact precision, and set it down without a single tremor. Perfect, controlled, experienced. And then, almost imperceptibly, his eyes darted toward the invitation resting on the table. A flicker of recognition, a micro-expression of satisfaction, vanished almost instantly, but it had been enough. Poirot caught it. Ah, Poirot murmured softly to himself. And there it is. He allowed the room to remain silent, letting the observation hang. The minor inconsistencies of movement had revealed what the notebook, the motives, and the past could not. The individual who had acted with certainty, who possessed both the freedom and the experience to execute a precise and unseen act. The very confidence required to perform the murder, a confidence born not of youth or impulsive recklessness but of knowledge, patience and practice evident in that small, deliberate gesture. The steward, though composed outwardly, had betrayed a subtle reaction, a crack in the polished exterior, a trace of recognition when confronted with the evidence in miniature. In that instant, Poirot knew that the threads of past grievances, the meticulous planning, and the social manipulation all converged in this unassuming figure. The psychological test had extracted from him what no testimony or physical evidence could: the faint, undeniable signature of the perpetrator. Poirot's eyes swept the room once more, calm but piercing. The pieces had aligned. The criminal, long hidden behind a mask of neutrality and efficiency, had revealed the truth without knowing it. And now, the detective thought, all that remained was to confirm what the little grey cells had already discerned, and to bring justice to a crime that had appeared so elegant, so impossible, and yet had left its most subtle trace in human behavior itself. The afternoon light had shifted into a muted gold as Poirot considered the subtle signs revealed by the psychological test. He had pinpointed the suspect, the steward, through nothing more than observation and patience. But just as he prepared to formalize his conclusions with the inspector, a sudden commotion arose near the sideboard where the champagne bottle, empty flutes, and the wax-stained saucer had been gathered. A young constable hurried into the room, face pale and lips pressed tight. "Monsieur Poirot?" "Inspector." The saucer, wax-stained one, "It's gone." The inspector's brow furrowed. "Gone? How?" I don't know, sir." "It was here a moment ago. I stepped away to retrieve another glass for inventory, and when I returned, it had vanished. Nothing else was disturbed, only the saucer." Poirot's eyes narrowed, scanning the room. The guests, still seated, had not moved from their places, yet the weight of tension now thickened the air. Someone had deliberately taken the key piece of physical evidence, the one fragment that connected the hostess glass, the wax, and the method of poisoning. Without it, the meticulous deduction he had been preparing to confirm risked being undermined. "Mais oui," Poirot murmured softly, fingertips pressed together. "The thief is clever, too clever to act without knowledge of what is truly important. The evidence vanishes, and yet the appearance of order remains. A distraction designed to mislead, to weaken our confidence, to render the case unsolvable in the eyes of others." The inspector's voice rose in frustration. "But who would do such a thing? The room has been sealed, everyone accounted for." Poirot's gaze swept the assembled guests, noting the almost imperceptible changes in demeanour, the subtle stiffening of the politician's shoulders, the woman with the handkerchief pressing her lips together for a fraction longer than necessary, and the steward, standing too straight, eyes flicking toward the now empty sideboard, as if silently reproaching someone invisible. "Exactly, Inspector," Poirot said softly. "The room has been sealed, yes, yet only one among us possesses the skill, the opportunity, and the calmness to remove a crucial object without alerting anyone. Observe closely, and you will see the truth not in the overt gestures, but in the micro-expressions, fleeting, subconscious movements that betray intent." Poirot turned toward the fireplace, where he had earlier noticed the steward standing quietly, hands folded. "Monsieur le Steward, would you mind explaining why your eyes have lingered on this spot repeatedly?" The man's posture remained stiff, yet a tiny tremor passed through his fingers. I was merely observing, Monsieur Poirot, ensuring that nothing further was disturbed." Poirot inclined his head slowly. "Ah, yes. But one observes differently when one knows the location of what has vanished. One observes with ownership. N'est-ce pas? A small shift, a flicker in the corner of the eye, and a mind can anticipate what it cannot yet see. Tell me, steward, where is the saucer?" The man's composure faltered ever so slightly. A brief clench of the jaw, a faint avoidance of Poirot's eyes. It was nothing dramatic, yet it was sufficient. The little grey cells sharpened. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, almost to himself, "we are now racing not only to uncover the truth, but to prevent it from being obscured. The thief understands the importance of this evidence and seeks to bury it, to erase a link that might expose him. Trust, mon ami, has become a delicate thread in a room full of suspicion. Each movement, each glance, each hesitation must now be watched with precision." The inspector scowled. "Do you think he's still in the house?" "Mais oui," Poirot replied. "He is clever, yes, but not omnipotent. The thief left signs. The faintest traces remain fingerprints on the edge of the sideboard, a subtle indentation in the carpet, a whisper of displaced dust. The vanishing is temporary, the truth, once found, is permanent. But we must act swiftly, before the opportunity to recover the evidencia confirm its absence is lost entirely. Poirot stepped carefully toward the place where the saucer had rested, examining the floor, the corners of the carpet, the subtle shifts in light reflecting off the polished wood. Somewhere, hidden, perhaps beneath a nearby piece of furniture or tucked in an inconspicuous drawer, lay the missing pieceth key to exposing not only the method of murder, but also the hand that had orchestrated it. And the criminal, watching from the shadows, knew that Poirot's attention was now sharpened, his patience deepened, and his resolve unshakable. The stakes had risen. The case, already complex, now contained an added peril, the deliberate concealment of the very object that could confirm guilt. Every moment of delay was an advantage to the perpetrator, and yet Poirot smiled faintly to himself, for in every act of concealment, the cleverness of the thief also left traces. The detective had only to perceive them. The mansion had grown quiet as evening fell, the golden light fading into a muted twilight that pressed the shadows deeper into the corners of each room. Poirot remained in the grand salon, crouched slightly over the empty sideboard, inspecting the faint traces left by the vanished saucer. The inspector and several constables combed the surrounding rooms, searching for the missing evidence, yet no sign of it appeared. Every movement in the house carried an invisible weight. Now every footstep seemed a potential signal from the unseen hand that had removed the key piece. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shrill cry from the corridor outside. The sound, full of shock and panic, cut through the quiet like a knife. Officers rushed toward the noise, with Poirot following at a measured pace, his eyes scanning, his mind already anticipating what awaited. At the far end of the hallway, near the servants' quarters, a young maid stumbled toward them, pale and trembling. "Monsieur Poirot." "Inspector." "The study." "Eich is gone." The steward is lying unconscious on the floor." The room they entered was in mild disarray. The steward lay slumped in a chair, a faint bruise forming on his temple, his eyes closed. The safe remained closed and intact, but the hostess' personal desk drawer normally locked stood open, papers spilling onto the floor. More alarming, the missing saucer was gone from its hiding place atop the desk. Someone had returned, swiftly and deliberately, and the scene suggested not only theft, but an attempt to intimidate or delay further investigation. Poirot knelt beside the steward, examining him carefully. The man was alive but dazed, a faint trickle of blood at his temple and a sheen of sweat across his brow. "He is conscious, yes?" Poirot asked. The inspector nodded. "Yes, but barely. He claims no memory of the attack, just that he felt a blow to the head and then nothing." Poirot's eyes swept the room, taking in the papers strewn across the floor, the empty drawer, the overturned chair. He noted the faint scuff marks leading toward the back of the study, traces that indicated a deliberate, controlled exit. The villain was clever, precise, and dangerously confident Simeone, accustomed to operating without witnesses and who understood the tension between curiosity and fear. The psychological implications were clear. The criminal was not finished. The second act was designed to unsettle, to test the detective, and to demonstrate that he or she remained several steps ahead. By attacking the steward, the perpetrator had removed the human obstacle, yet left the evidence tantalizingly within reach, hidden but observable. Poirot rose slowly, his gaze sweeping the study. The open drawer, the displaced papers, the missing saucer, and the faint scent of wax lingering in the air all told a story of deliberate timing and psychological manipulation. The criminal had returned to ensure that the first investigation would be thrown into confusion, that trust between observer and witness would weaken, and that panic might lead to mistakes. He turned toward the inspector. "Mon ami, the villain's audacity increases. It is no longer a question solely of solving the past crime. We must now prevent another, for the perpetrator is active, aware of our methods, and willing to strike to protect secrecy. Observe the pattern. The attack is calculated, swift, and leaves a clue or two to mislead. This is not desperation. It is mastery." The inspector scowled, rubbing his temples. "Do you think he will strike again tonight?" "Mais oui," Poirot said, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The longer he remains unchecked, the more confident he grows. He has studied the rhythms of this household, the routines of each guest and officer. He knows when we are least prepared. We must anticipate his next move, predict it, and act preemptively. Poirot's attention returned to the faint impressions in the carpet and the corner of the study where the papers had been disturbed. He crouched, examining the minute scuffs, the subtle dust displaced by hurried movement. Each mark, though almost invisible, told a story. The second act was not just an attack, it was a message. The villain intended to dictate the pace, to challenge the authorities, and to demonstrate that the game was still under their control. As the room fell into tense silence, Poirot's mind worked with quiet ferocity. The stakes had risen. The missing saucer, the assault on the steward, the subtle manipulation Saul indicated a criminal who not only understood the mechanics of the murder, but also the psychology of those pursuing him. Now, Poirot realized, the case demanded vigilance, intuition, and anticipation beyond ordinary deduction. Every movement, every glance, every gesture could conceal the next threat. The detective, calm as always, prepared himself. He was no longer merely solving a crime, he was entering a battle of wits against a mind as patient, precise, and merciless as his own. The villain remained in the shadows, and Poirot, for the first time that day, allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. He knew the little grey cells were ready, and he knew that, however cunning, the criminal would soon reveal the final piece of the puzzle. The mansion had fallen into an uneasy quiet as evening deepened, broken only by the occasional murmur of officers reviewing their notes or the soft creak of servants moving cautiously through the halls. Poirot remained in the grand salon, alone for the moment, his eyes drifting over the scattered pieces of the investigation. The missing saucer, the wax residue, the overturned desk in the study, the bruised steward, and the anxious faces of the guests who now lingered at the periphery, fearful of what might come next. As he walked slowly among the tables and chairs, examining the polished surfaces and glinting crystal, his mind began to sort through the chaos. The attacks, the vanishing evidence, the subtle psychological reactions of the suspects were not random. There was a method, a rhythm, a pattern to the night's disturbances. And, as often happened in cases of cunning design, the smallest details held the greatest significance. Poirot's attention fell on a trivial item, almost laughably insignificant. A single piece of crumpled stationery, folded unevenly, lying half-hidden beneath the edge of a rug near the sideboard. It was one of the leftover invitations from the evening, discarded or perhaps left deliberately. He picked it up carefully, smoothing the creases. There, in the margin, was a tiny notation, barely legible, a date, an initial, and a brief, cryptic phrase. He paused, recalling the earlier newspaper clipping he had found in the library, the scandal from years ago connecting the politician and the hostess. The margin note echoed a pattern of old grievances and carefully timed actions. He considered the wax-stained saucer, now gone, and the manner in which the steward had reacted when confronted during the psychological test. The subtle micro-expression, the slight flicker of recognition when the evidence was discussed, now fit perfectly with the notation on the discarded invitation. The villain had relied on routine, on predictability, and on the assumption that no one would notice what appeared trivial. Yet this small detail, overlooked by all others, revealed the timing, the method, and the hand behind the acts. Poirot crouched and examined the edge of the rug. There was a faint dust displacement, a trail invisible to anyone untrained, leading toward the corner where the steward's desk and the locked drawer had stood. He followed it in his mind, imagining the careful movements of a practiced hand, placing the saucer temporarily out of sight, lifting documents, and orchestrating the apparent chaos while keeping control of the situation. It all began to cohere. The theft of the saucer, the attack on the steward, the precise placement of each object. The seemingly minor notes and gestures from the guest thieves were not isolated events. They were components of a single strategy, executed with patience, knowledge, and attention to detail. The criminal had relied on others' assumptions, trusting that a notebook, a tremor, or a fleeting glance would distract investigators, while the real evidence was manipulated. Poirot's gaze returned to the guests. The politician's carefully measured answers, the woman with the handkerchief's rehearsed grief, even the young heir's nervous fluster, all fit into a larger tableau. but only one figure had moved through it with the deliberate precision necessary to control the chaos. The steward. Each act he had witnessed or executed, each subtle glance or suppressed expression, now formed a consistent pattern. His movements were always consistent with someone who had intimate knowledge of the household, who understood the habits of every guest, who could act with both authority and subtlety. The detective rose slowly, hands clasped behind his back. The threads of the evening disparate at first glance, chaotic in their dételesno, aligned in a discernible pattern. The missing saucer, the wax residue, the psychological test, the micro-expressions, the margin note all pointed to the same conclusion. The villain had been hiding in plain sight, relying on routine and subtlety rather than overt force. And all along, the key to uncovering the truth had been present, quietly signaling itself to the careful observer. Poirot allowed himself a faint smile. The little grey cells had not been deceived. The pattern was clear. The mystery, once scattered and confounding, now had a skeleton, a structure built from minute observations, historical connections, and the disciplined orchestration of an intelligent mind. The game had shifted, and the detective now held the insight needed to confront the criminal. The final act, he knew, would require courage, patience, and precision, but at last, the hidden design of the evening lay revealed. The truth had always been there, quietly waiting for one who knew how to see. Poirot remained standing in the grand salon, eyes sweeping the room once more, letting the subtle shifts in posture, the brief exchanges of glances, and the faintest traces of tension settle fully into his mind. The pattern of the evening had crystallized, and with it, the pieces of the puzzle had begun to align. Yet Poirot knew that understanding opportunity and method alone would not reveal the deepest truth. The human heart, with all its hidden obsessions, could often provide a motive far more compelling and far darker than mere greed or jealousy. He motioned for the inspector to join him near the fireplace, where the dying embers cast trembling light across the polished floor. "Mon ami," Poirot said quietly, "we have understood the mechanics, the pattern of action, the careful orchestration. But one question remains unanswered. Why? Why would a person act with such calculation, such patience, and such cold detachment?" The inspector shrugged, frustration evident. "Money? Reputation? Revenge?" Poirot shook his head. That is too simple. The superficial reasons might explain opportunity, yes, but they do not explain obsession. There is a compulsion here, a psychological force driving every movement, every act, every carefully concealed decision. He turned toward the assembled guests, though he addressed none directly. His gaze lingered on the steward, who now stood quietly, pretending calm, yet still betraying the tiniest of micro-expressions when meeting Poirot's eye. Consider, Inspector, the steward's position. Years of service, years of observation, countless details absorbed without ever being questioned. He has lived in the margins of influence, watching the hostess control, manipulate, and command, yet never able to participate fully in the world he sees. A resentment grows quietly, silently, until it becomes fixation. Poirot's voice softened, almost conversational, as though explaining a subtle moral to a child. The crime is not merely transactional. It is not about wealth or social advantage. It is about control, about asserting dominion over the one whose life has shaped the rhythms of his own existence. The hostess, unknowingly, represented a world he could never enter, a power he could never wield. And so, step by step, he orchestrated a scenario in which he could exercise the ultimate control, the very life and death of the woman who had commanded his gaze for years. He gestured to the scattered remnants of the evening's missing saucer, the wax-stained invitation, the carefully disrupted study. Every detail, every precision, was not merely functional. It was symbolic. The wax, the poisoned flute, the disappearing evidencethi were instruments in a demonstration of power, a way for the steward to assert his intellect, his mastery, and, ultimately, his superiority over one he had long admired and long resented in equal measure. The inspector stared, comprehension dawning with unease. "You mean, it wasn't revenge? Not from money or personal gain?" Poirot shook his head. "No, mon ami. Those are the motives most would suspect, and the reason the notebook, the micro-expressions, the distractions, all misled us initially. The true motive is far deeper, far more intimate. It is the psychology of someone who has lived in proximity to greatness without ever touching it, who envies not only the wealth or the influence, but the very agency of another life. And that envy, when nurtured over time, transforms into a meticulous, cold determination to impose one's will. Poirot's gaze sharpened as he studied the steward's expression, noting the imperceptible tightening of the jaw, the faint lift of the eyebrows, and the slight avoidance of direct eye contact. Notice, Inspector, the smallest gestures. Here lies the shadow of obsession. The crime is personal, and personal crimes, those born of fixation rather than opportunity, require precision, patience, and secrecy. They are executed not for advantage, but for satisfaction, for the fulfillment of a need that cannot be named aloud. He took a measured breath, folding his hands behind his back. This explains the careful orchestration, the timing, the vanishing evidence, and the recent attack on the steward. Every action was intended not merely to conceal, but to confirm control. The villain was willing to risk exposure, to manipulate, to intimidate, simply to maintain the illusion of dominion until the very last moment. Poirot allowed the room to remain silent, letting the weight of the revelation settle. Slowly he approached the steward, who now met his gaze with a flicker of apprehension. "And so, mon ami," Poirot said gently, yet with unyielding authority, "the motive is no longer hidden. It has been laid bare by your own careful design. Obsession, envy, and the need for control these drove you to such extremes. The little grey cells, as always, have observed what was invisible to all others." For a moment, the steward's composure faltered entirely. The faint tremor that had betrayed him earlier now grew visible in his hands. His eyes darted toward the sideboard, toward the missing saucer, toward the empty spaces that had carried the signature of his actions. Poirot's deductions, patiently assembled from observation, history, and minute psychological insight, had illuminated the dark interior of a mind that had believed itself beyond detection. The truth, finally, was revealed. The crime had never been about what the world could see, it had been about what the criminal could not resist controlling, step by careful step, in a deadly display of personal obsession. And in that revelation, Poirot knew the path to justice was clear. The grand salon, dimly lit by the fading evening light, had settled into a tense stillness. Guests lingered near the periphery, murmuring quietly, while officers fidgeted with notes and reports. Poirot, calm and deliberate as ever, surveyed the room. The sequence of events, the first murder, the vanishing evidence, the attack on the steward, and the subtle psychological cue shot, all led to this moment. He knew exactly how to draw the final act from its hiding place. He addressed the group in his soft, deliberate tone. "Mesdames et messieurs, I believe that the truth is now within our reach. The events of this evening have been carefully orchestrated, yes, but a sequence of errorstini, almost imperceptible, has allowed us to observe the hand that guided them. And so, I propose that we demonstrate a small experiment, much like the test we performed with the glasses." A hush fell over the room. The guests glanced at one another, uncertainty and unease passing between them like a current. Poirot's eyes, however, never wavered from the steward, who remained rigid, attempting an air of casual detachment. "Inspector," Poirot continued, "please ensure that the doors remain closed and that no one exits without our knowledge. The hand that struck so carefully before cannot escape if it believes itself observed. And now, mon ami, we shall see if our suspect maintains composure when faced with the truth." Poirot moved to the sideboard where the missing saucer had been hidden earlier. He produced it quietly from beneath a folded cloth, placing it on the polished surface so that the wax stain gleamed faintly in the lamplight. He then spoke directly, his voice soft but cutting, as though slicing through the tension itself. "Monsieur le steward," he said, eyes steady on the man, "this object, though it vanished for a time, has returned to its rightful place. And with it, we understand the method, the timing, and the precision of the act that has caused so much fear. You see, the smallest trace wax, glass, impressions in the carpet cannot lie. They speak for themselves, even when a man believes he is clever enough to conceal them." The steward's hands twitched almost imperceptibly, his lips pressed together. For a moment he said nothing, attempting to maintain the mask of composure, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. Poirot stepped closer, his calm presence magnifying the pressure. "Tell me, monsieur," Poirot said gently. Do you recognize the pattern that emerges? The meticulous attention to detail, the precise timing, the deliberate vanishing of evidence, and the assault meant to confuse us. Each element speaks to your understanding of this household, your knowledge of habits, of fears, and of opportunities. You have controlled the situation, yes, but only for so long. The steward's breathing grew slightly uneven, and his eyes darted nervously to the study's doorway, then back to the detective. The mask slipped for just a fraction of a second micro-expression of guilt and recognition that Poirot seized instantly. "Monsieur," the steward whispered, voice trembling. I did it. I meant only to show control, to prove," his words faltered, and the room seemed to shrink around him. The guests exchanged anxious glances, some incredulous, some fearful, while the inspector stepped forward, ready to act. Poirot allowed the confession to linger, to settle the tension. "Yes, monsieur," he said softly, almost kindly. "You acted with precision and patience, but your obsession betrayed you. Control, envy, and the need to assert yourself over one who has lived more fullethies drove your actions, not greed, not revenge alone. And so the truth is revealed." The steward's posture collapsed as officers moved in to secure him, his final attempt at maintaining authority extinguished. He made no resistance. The weight of exposure, of the careful net Poirot had woven, was too heavy to bear. Poirot's gaze swept the room one last time, noting the subtle relief in some faces, the lingering shock in others. The mansion seemed to exhale, the tension dissipating, replaced by the quiet acknowledgement of resolution. All the vanishing evidence, the attacks, the psychological manipulations all had been orchestrated by one mind, driven by obsession and the desire for control. The detective straightened, smoothing his jacket. "Justice is served," he said softly, "not merely by catching a criminal, but by understanding the mind that guided the crime. And now, mon ami, the evening's mysteries have been laid bare, every shadow accounted for, every detail explained. The case is complete." The inspector nodded, still catching his breath, while the remaining guests murmured softly among themselves. Poirot, serene as always, allowed a faint smile, knowing that the little grey cells had once again unveiled what others could not see, the invisible hand behind the carefully constructed chaos and the true measure of human obsession. The room had settled into a fragile calm. The steward, now in custody, had confessed, and the explanation of obsession and control seemed to bring closure. Guests murmured quietly, relief washing over their faces. The inspector straightened his notes, preparing to file the report, while Poirot stood near the fireplace, eyes scanning the room with his habitual intensity. Everything appeared to be concluded. Yet, Poirot's instincts, honed over decades, whispered that the story was not yet complete. He had learned long ago that criminals, especially those clever enough to manipulate evidence and orchestrate psychological tension, often left one final secret, a hidden move to ensure their plan was never fully understood. Something niggled at him, a detail dismissed earlier, a hesitation, a glance too quick to register. Poirot walked slowly through the room, letting his gaze fall upon each guest in turn. Then it came to him, the faintest anomaly he had overlooked in the chaos of the evening, the young heir. Always nervous, yes. Always flustered, yes. But there had been something peculiar in his interactions, a faint insistence on defending the steward, a subtle attempt to redirect suspicion, even while appearing helpless. Small, almost imperceptible signs, but to Poirot they sang like a clear note amid discord. He stepped forward, voice calm, yet carrying a weight that made the room freeze. "Mon ami, may I have a word with you?" The heir looked up, startled, sweat prickling his brow. Poirot gestured for the others to remain at a distance, allowing a brief private moment. "You see," Poirot began, soft and deliberate, "we have examined the steward's actions, and yes, his obsession and knowledge allowed him to commit a terrible crime. But tell Muho provided him the opportunity to conceal the saucer in the first place. Who ensured that the evidence could vanish and be returned without detection?" The heir swallowed nervously. I don't know what you mean, monsieur." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice lowering into a tone of gentle persuasion. "But you do." "For it was you who, under the guise of fear and nervousness, allowed the steward the chance to manipulate the evidence, to execute his plan unobserved. You created a distraction, intentionally or unconsciously, by your repeated clumsiness and misdirection. And when the second act occurred, the tack on the steward you was strangely absent, or at least positioned conveniently to avoid scrutiny. The young heir's lips trembled. I only meant I wanted to protect everyone. The second didn't. Poirot raised a single finger. Mon ami, your intention is less relevant than the result. You, knowingly or unknowingly, assisted the steward. Your little Manaversier insistence on defending him earlier, your nervous interference injured the precision of the act. The real mastermind, the person who orchestrated events from behind the apparent chaos, was closer to us than we realized. You must understand, little grey cells see not only action but consequence. The heir's face went pale. He shifted, looking toward the now subdued steward, realization dawning with horror. But it wasn't supposed to go this far, he whispered. I never meant. Poirot's gaze softened, though his mind remained razor-sharp. Exactly, mon ami. The plan was conceived, the steward executed with skill, but the smallest hand, the faintest influence, altered the course of events. You were the unseen catalyst, the final touch that allowed precision to flourish. And so, what seemed a resolved case is now revealed to be a more complex weave of action, influence, and unintended consequence. The inspector stepped closer, confused. So you're saying he's partially responsible? Poirot nodded gently. Indirectly, yes, the mastermind is still the steward, yet the framework of opportunity required another's subtle participation, a mind untrained in deception but present at the right moment. Such is the nature of clever crime. It relies not only on calculation but on circumstance, on those who unknowingly facilitate it. The room remained silent, the gravity of the revelation settling over the guests. The young heir's shoulders slumped, and he sank into a chair, trembling. Poirot allowed a pause, letting the full weight of cause and consequence resonate. And now, Poirot continued, voice steady, we understand the complete tapestry. The obsession, the hidden hand, the catalyst, and the unintended collaboration all come together. Justice will be served, yes, but the lesson is that appearances, however conclusive, can conceal layers unseen. One must always remain vigilant, even when victory seems assured. In that moment, the mansion felt alive with the intricate threads of human ambition, error, and desire. Poirot, as always, stood apart yet entirely present, the final twist unveiled, his genius tested and proven once more. The case, now fully understood, would soon be closed, but not before the lingering echoes of subtle deception reminded all present that in human affairs, the smallest actions often carry the heaviest weight. The mansion had grown quiet once more. Officers had secured the steward, the young heir sat trembling and pale, and the guests lingered in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of the final revelation. Poirot stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, eyes sweeping the room with the serene precision of a mind that had unraveled the night's intricate web. The steward's confession, paired with the unexpected role of the heir as inadvertent facilitator, had brought the truth into clear focus, but Poirot knew that understanding the sequence of events was not the same as delivering justice. He turned toward the inspector, his expression calm yet resolute. Mon ami, the case, while largely resolved, contains nuances that demand careful attention. Observe the steward, a man whose obsession and desire for control drove him to commit murder, yet his actions relied upon circumstance and the unthinking complicity of another. The truth, though partially revealed, is richer, more complex than mere confession alone could convey. Poirot began to retrace the night's events for the assembled company, pointing out the subtle, nearly invisible signs that had escaped attention. The wax-stained saucer, for instance, vanished not because of haste, but by design. Its disappearance and subsequent reappearance was intended to mislead, to create doubt, to divert our focus from the central method. Yet it left a trace, a slight shift in dust upon the sideboard, a faint indentation upon the rug details that spoke louder than words, if one knew how to observe. He moved slowly through the room, gesturing to the scattered papers on the study desk. The open drawer, though alarming, contained no evidence of theft beyond that which the steward had orchestrated. Yet notice the position of the documents, the folding of the envelopes, the barely perceptible sequence in which items were displaced. Each minute detail spoke of deliberate planning, of someone intimately familiar with both the household and the habits of its occupants. Poirot's gaze fell on the young heir. "And you, though acting without malice, provided the final catalyst." A glance here, a question there, a subtle deflection seemingly trivial, yet enough to allow the steward the opportunity to manipulate events unnoticed. "Your role, though innocent in intention, demonstrates the delicate interplay of action and consequence in human affairs." The inspector frowned. "So justice is served, but only partially. The criminal acted, and yet the conditions that allowed him to succeed remain." "Precisely," Poirot said, eyes narrowing. "Justice in its purest form is rarely absolute. Here, the law will take the steward into custody. Yes, and he will answer for his deeds. But the case leaves behind a lingering shadow, a reminder that clever minds, hidden motives, and unobserved acts can leave truths obscured until revealed by careful observation." Poirot paused near the fireplace, hands steepled beneath his chin, and allowed the room to absorb the full import of his words. Consider also the micro-expressions, the tremor in the hand, the fleeting hesitation, the nearly imperceptible glance. These were the signatures of the crime, hidden in plain sight. To the untrained eye, they were nothing. To the little grey cells, they were everything. Observation, patience, and understanding human nature, these are the tools that separate the detective from the ordinary. He allowed a faint, knowing smile to cross his face. The steward believed he had controlled every variable, yet he underestimated one constant: the mind of the investigator. Every act of deception leaves a shadow, and in shadows, truths may be discerned. We have caught him not by force alone, nor by mere evidence, but by reading the invisible signatures of human action. The steward, still seated in a chair, under the watchful eyes of the officers, lowered his head, his expression a mixture of resignation and quiet awe. The young heir, pale but relieved, looked toward Poirot with tentative gratitude. Poirot straightened, giving a small nod to the inspector. "The law will now act, and the immediate danger is removed. Yet remember, mon ami, the case leaves an aftertaste of caution. Cleverness, obsession, and circumstance may converge in ways we do not anticipate. Justice has been served, but the lessons of the evening endure. The mind that observes, the patience that discerns, and the subtle art of noticing these are the enduring weapons of the detective." He turned once more to survey the room, calm as ever, eyes reflecting the depth of understanding that had unraveled the mystery. The mansion, though returning to a semblance of normalcy, still seemed alive with the echoes of the night's events. The vanished evidence, the attacks, the hidden motives, the overlooked gestures. Poirot had illuminated them all, proving, as always, that the little grey cells could uncover truths invisible to everyone else, and that even in a case seemingly concluded, the mind of a true detective remains one step ahead. The mansion had finally quieted. Officers led the steward away, the young heir slumped into a chair, still shaken, and the remaining guests drifted toward the exits, murmuring softly, eager to leave behind the tension of the evening. Poirot, however, lingered, his gaze tracing the patterns of light and shadow across the polished floors, the fireplace's embers casting faint flickers over the walls. He had solved the mystery, unraveled the obsession that had driven a man to murder, and revealed the unseen catalyst. Yet, in the silence of the grand salon, a small unease tugged at the edges of his consciousness. He moved slowly through the room, eyes scanning the corners, the edges of the rugs, and the surfaces of the furniture with meticulous care. Every trace of the evening had been examined, yet his mind clung to a single elusive thought: a small detailed angle of the candlestick on the side table, a nearly imperceptible smudge near the window latch. A faint scent lingering in the air refused to fit neatly into the tidy narrative he had constructed. It was subtle, almost trivial, yet it whispered that the night's events might not have been as fully resolved as everyone believed. Poirot picked up the candlestick, turning it in his hands. There, at the base, was a minute scratch, one that could only have been made by deliberate handling, not by the clumsy movements of the steward. His mind worked, assembling possibilities. Perhaps an accomplice? Perhaps a misdirection even more clever than he had anticipated? Or merely an artifact of the steward's obsessive attention to detail? A trace overlooked in the chaos. He replaced the candlestick carefully. stepping back and allowing the room to settle once more. The shadows clung to the corners, deepening as the last of the twilight faded into night. Poirot's gaze rested for a long moment on the window overlooking the gardens. Somewhere beyond that glass, secrets remained hidden, and he knew that the game of observation was never truly complete. One could solve a crime, uncover a motive, and bring a villain to justice. Yet the world offered new puzzles, new subtleties, and new deceptions at every turn. A soft tap echoed behind him. Turning, he saw the young heir lingering by the doorway, uncertain, hesitant. "Monsieur Poirot, will it ever truly be over?" Poirot inclined his head, expression serene, almost wistful. "Mon ami, in human affairs, it is never truly over. One case may conclude, yes, but the world is full of mysteries waiting to be observed, understood, and resolved. One learns not only from the crimes themselves, but from the traces they leave behind, patterns, the micro-expressions, the details others dismiss. Even when justice is served, questions remain. That is the nature of life, and the mind that seeks truth must always be vigilant." The heir nodded slowly, understanding dawning, though a faint shiver ran through him. Poirot's eyes returned to the room, lingering on the subtle shadows, the corners where a trace might still exist, where an unnoticed gesture could hold meaning. The evening had been resolved, yet the detective knew that the delicate threads of human action rarely ended neatly. There was always another clue, another puzzle, another deception waiting in the wings. Poirot walked to the door, hands folded behind his back, his gait unhurried yet deliberate. He paused for a final glance over his shoulder. The mansion, once a stage for meticulous calculation, now seemed calm, almost ordinary, but the calm was deceptive. The night's events had left an echo, a faint vibration in the air, suggesting that all was not as simple as it appeared. A cryptic message, a fleeting glance, a trace of movement in the corner of one's eyes were the reminders that the world still held secrets. As he stepped into the cool night air, the lanterns lining the driveway casting long, tremulous shadows, Poirot's thoughts were already moving forward, anticipating new cases, new mysteries, new minds to outwit. The night was complete, the immediate danger resolved, yet in the quiet corners of his mind he knew the little grey cells would remain alert, waiting for the next puzzle to reveal itself. And so, as the mansion receded behind him, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, Poirot walked on, the evening shadows fading, but never entirely disappearing. The case was closed, yet the lingering question remained, delicate and persistent. Somewhere, somehow, a mystery awaited, subtle, intricate, and just beyond the reach of ordinary perception. Justice had been served, but the mind of the detective, as always, was already one step ahead of the world, ready for whatever came next.